Hi, this is Brett Cenkus. I am the owner of Cenkus Law. We're based in Austin, Texas. We're a business transactions firm. And today we're talking about, are non-competes enforceable? Broadly, in most states, yes. In Texas, they've gotten a lot easier to enforce in recent years. But let's back up for a moment and distinguish two common contexts in which non-competes show up. One is in the employment context. So if you employ me, you might say, Brett, I'm going to give you this job, I'm going to let you under the hood, you're going to have access to my customers, and for that you're going to agree not to compete with me for at least 2 years after you leave. That's employment. Another context in which they show up, we do a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and they're very common. That if I buy your business, I want to know you're not going to be competing against me the next day. So in the employment context, they're harder to enforce, and in some states like California, almost impossible to shut down someone's competition with you generally. In the sale of the business context, easier to enforce, and even in California, generally enforceable. Because it's viewed as, I think there's an understanding that that's viewed as necessary for business sales. It's part of the goodwill you're buying, and that fundamentally, I think there's an understanding that there's a lot more balance of power in the purchase of a business context. And I'd include in the sale of a business partnerships. Maybe it's kind of a third context, but it's really a subcontext of the sale of a business. It relates to goodwill and a balance of power, people coming together to form a business partnership. If you and I go into a partnership together and we agree we will not compete with each other in the partnership even after we cease to be partners, that's a lot easier to enforce, much like the sale of a business or business interest compared to employment. Okay, so even in California, sale of a business and business partnerships, those non-competes can be enforced. The employment non-competes, almost impossible. Even when non-competes are enforceable, they need to be restricted in three different ways. One is by scope of activity, another is by geographically, and another is time. So scope of activity, if I run a company that does lawn care and I give you access to all my secrets and you sign a non-compete and say you won't compete with me for 2 years, I probably can't stop you from opening up a business that prunes hedges if that's not what I do, or that sells fertilizer, right? It's got to be related to what I do. I've got to have a really justifiable reason to not have you competing. It's got to really affect me. This is about protecting my interests, not just stopping you from doing something. Geographically, that if that lawn care business only has clients in Austin, then I can't stop you from cutting grass in Pocatello, Idaho, or even Dallas. And time is typically going to be, a year, a couple years. In the mergers and acquisitions and business partnership context, we'll often see 3 years. In M&A, business acquisitions, we might see 4 or 5 years. I've seen them as long as 10 years. That almost certainly would not be enforced by a Texas court. But I think the idea there is that a sophisticated party, you would hope that they know what they're signing up to, will honor their agreement and not try and challenge it in court. But that's definitely the outer range of what I think you could defend anywhere in any context for a non-compete. And so those three things, again, California, employment context, almost impossible, maybe impossible to enforce a non-compete. But in the business partnership or business acquisition, the M&A space, it is. In Texas, you could get them enforced in the employment context in a lot more than you used to be able to in a lot of cases. And in all these cases, and in other states and contexts, the restrictions, those three ways of restricting, it's really important to do that. Some states the court, like in Texas, a court will come in and they will revise the non-compete to say, hey, that was too far. 10 years is too long. We'll reform it. We'll just change it. It's called blue penciling. That's what the lawyers call it. We'll knock it down to 4 years, right? So a court will just do that as a matter of course. Still, in a contract, we usually write, corporate lawyers will say, if this is found to be unreasonable for whatever reason, the court should change it to make it as enforceable as possible. In certain states, like Virginia, the court won't reform it. So I'm not entirely sure. It's a little bit unclear to me whether or not if you put in the contract that the court should reform it, that would work. But you certainly don't want to have a non-compete that pushes too far. That's for 10 years in Virginia, and then run the risk that a court just throws it out, because they will do that. All these things, by the way, are a little bit different. This is outside the scope of this video, but you still, separate from non-competes and the ability to stop someone from earning a living, there are Some states look at a no solicit clause a little bit differently. So one that says, you can go do whatever you want. You can compete with me, but you can't come take my customers and my employees for a certain number of years, something like that. That's a little easier. Not really any difference in Texas, technically, in how courts look at it, but in some states that may be looked at differently and certainly looks more reasonable. And then a company can protect its confidential information and its trade secrets regardless of whether or not a court would enforce their non-compete. So that's a whole other separate issue, which is if I give you access to if I run Google, I wish I did, but if I ran Google and I had access to the Google algorithm, the search algorithm, or Coca-Cola, and I know the recipe to Coca-Cola, I let you see it, no matter what, even if you could go compete with me, you can't use that trade secret. And there's a lot more to trade secrets, but that's a whole separate issue. So anyway, non-competes, much more enforceable than you probably have been told. If you have any questions about this, if you're an employer or an employee and you're wondering, could this be enforced? Do I need to adhere to this? Reach out to me. Thanks.